Communication, a vital component used by all organisms on the planet in many different ways. Whales sing, wolves howl, birds tweet. Communication is even used by one of the smallest forms of life on Earth, bacteria, to cause our bodies to develop infections. Yet, on their own, these individual strands of bacteria cannot single-handedly cause infections in human beings. Instead, they must all emit a communication molecule until there are more of them, enough of them to all collectively know when they are strong enough to attack. And then, boom, the bacteria begin releasing toxins all at the same time, and we have a spectacular result. A tangible, real-world effect caused by these microscopic creatures. An effect that could have otherwise not occurred without the use of communication and an understanding of their goal. But there's something even greater about our ways of communicating that separates us from these microbes and animals. There's something that makes our forms of communication more impactful and conclusive. The answer is pretty simple, and I gave it away the moment I began speaking, because I have been communicating with you certain ideas, and will continue to do so throughout this talk with this spectacular technology invented by humans. A technology greater than the television, computer, smartphone. A technology called language, and it has allowed our brains to accomplish astonishing things. Just to give you an idea of what language can enable us to do, I would like everyone to close their eyes. Imagine a blue giraffe dancing to the beat of electronic music. Got it? Okay, now open your eyes. Hopefully you've never had this thought before, but my point stands. Your brain has just formed the image of something that has never before existed in history, and I hope never will. And the image that you formed in your mind of a blue giraffe dancing to the beat of electronic music was partially dependent on you and your preconceived concepts. For instance, you had to already know what the color blue looks like, what a giraffe is, what it means to do the action of dancing, and have an idea of what electronic music sounds like just to form the mental picture to begin with. Yet, the set of images that you imagined were particularly unique to you because it involved your unique experiences. That means, while your mental picture may have looked like this, another person's may have looked like this, or even like this. With the use of language, I have just implanted a completely new image, a completely new idea into your mind. And that's how communication works. It's the constant sharing of ideas completely unique to how the people listening perceive the language. But first, a major misconception about language is that we think we only use it to communicate to others. But in actuality, we use language to think to ourselves too. At a young age, I came to this realization. As any child would, I began learning my mother tongue from, well, my mother. My mother was French, which meant that the first language I would learn to speak would be French. My father was Italian, and for the sake of simplicity, he decided to speak to me in French since the beginning. He would still, however, read to me Italian nursery rhymes at bedtime, and he made his best effort to keep me in touch with my Italian culture. And when my mother left, my new mother figure from Argentina entered my life. And while all of this was happening, I was living in Texas. So now, two predominant languages were spoken in the household, French and Spanish, which left me with a lack of exposure to English, a language spoken everywhere else outside of the house. Because of this, when it became time for me to enroll in preschool, I struggled communicating with my classmates. My thoughts were in French, and my means to communicate with my environment at school and at home involved the use of 2, sometimes 3 different languages. I struggled adapting to these multiple languages, and I felt as if I were a whale singing and expecting the wolves to howl back. The problem was, and still is, the whales and the wolves do not communicate in the same way as my peers. I did not speak the same language. And I realized that these different languages affected my thinking in different ways. And in this process, I understood that I was different in my thinking and my speaking from those around me. And this may sound really confusing, and it was probably even more confusing when I lived it, because as a kid I had to act as a translation machine for almost every word and statement used. When I was told to clean up by my English-speaking teachers at school, I would have to translate the phrase to French and tell myself I would have to faire le ménage like I was taught to do at home, and then I would begin to clean up. And at home, when I was told by my Spanish-speaking stepmother to hacer las tareas de la casa, I would have to first translate the phrase to French and then to English before I could respond with actions. These multiple languages shaped my thinking processes. This idea that language influences our thinking is supported by the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, otherwise known as linguistic relativity, a theory advanced in the 20th century by American linguists Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf. One study that describes this theory looks at how different languages divide the color spectrum up somewhat differently. For example, in English, the term blue can be used to describe all these shades of blue. Unlike in English, however, the Russian language does not have a word for blue. Instead, they make a distinction between lighter shades of blue, goluboy, and darker shades of blue, sini. This raises the question, does this difference in language lead to differences in how these native speakers discriminate colors? Well, cognitive scientist Lara Boroditsky and her research team devised an experiment to answer this question and found that Russian speakers, especially in near color comparisons, showed a category advantage over English speakers. That is, Russian speakers were faster to discriminate between two different colors when they fell under the linguistic categories of goluboy and sini, as opposed to just one linguistic category. The critical difference in this case is not that English speakers cannot distinguish between lighter and darker shades of blue, but rather that Russian speakers cannot avoid distinguishing them. They must do so in order to speak Russian in a conventional manner. Supporters of the linguistic relativity theory take this as evidence that language does indeed influence thought and perception, even in the non-linguistic task of color perceptual discriminations. So let's go back to the scenario of imagining a blue giraffe. You can see that if we start translating this into different languages, we will immediately run into problems because the word blue in itself may not necessarily mean anything in one language. However, the Russian language isn't the only language that distinguishes color hues differently than in the English language. In fact, there are many cultures across the world that talk about color differently, and some don't even have a word for color at all. So, does this mean that color isn't a universal human experience? Well, it's almost impossible to believe that the rainbow isn't viewed or described in the same way by all people on the planet, or that there may be more or fewer colors in the world than we believe, or that some people don't even give names to colors. But when we look at a rainbow, this makes sense. For me, and probably for most of you, we see 7 colors in a rainbow. We learned this in the acronym ROY-G-BIV in elementary school. However, different cultures may have different acronyms to describe a different set of colors. There are no legitimate lines on a natural rainbow. So why should there be a reason to believe that one culture's color list is any more correct than another? Why should there be a reason to believe that your imagination of a blue giraffe dancing to the beat of electronic music is any more correct than that of the person sitting next to you? Again, our ideas stem from the preconceived concepts we get from the languages we learn to speak. So what I am telling you is that in the same way that I experience communication gaps between the languages of French, English, Spanish, and even Italian, different societies experience these similar gaps when interacting with others, even when it comes to defining what colors are. We think differently because of the languages we speak. We interact differently because of the languages we speak. We act differently because of the languages we speak. But there are also gaps in a different type of language. Love languages. You see, contrary to popular belief, love is a language. It's the first one we learn to understand and later on to speak. We feel its presence or its absence, and it is critical to all humans when we're born. That's why babies need to feel the love, the physical touch of a caregiver. It is vital to their survival. Love is a language on the surface. It's a way by which we can communicate with each other, often without the use of words. But underneath this, love is like a rainbow, and much like how our actual languages can split up a rainbow differently, causing some cultures to give names to some colors and not to others, or altogether not giving names to colors at all, we also have different personal reactions to the different languages of love. There's no one correct way to split up the rainbow, and there's no one correct way to perceive love. And just like how we all have different perceptions of color, we all have different perceptions of love as well. And the best way to close this gap that exists between our different love languages, we actually have to sit down and understand what they are. One psychologist in particular, Gary Chapman, splits this love rainbow into 5 distinct languages. Words of affirmation can be saying words such as thank you or I appreciate what you did. Receiving gifts involves the thoughtfulness and effort behind a gift. Acts of service can be doing things such as making breakfast or walking the dog. Quality time involves giving someone your undivided attention. And finally, physical touch can be anything from a hug to a reassuring pat on the back. Love is the first language we learn. It was the first one I learned before French or English or Spanish. And just like how I found it difficult to speak English or Spanish when all I was accustomed to was French, it can be difficult for us as humans to give or to receive different communications of love when we don't quite understand them. These love languages can help us figure out exactly what it is we want to give or to receive. For me, finding these love languages was especially important in my family. You see, I had already dealt with the challenges of a multicultural family, and from there stemmed the clash of languages and ideals. And I'm not just talking about the clash of cultures that I experienced in my household. Because yes, it's true, I did not speak the same language as my parents or my peers. We had grown up with a different set of ideas, and I had already faced the obstacles of communication speaking English and Spanish when all I spoke was French. But there was another barrier existing too, because we did not all speak the same language, and we did not all speak the same love language. I'm sure at least some of you can relate with what I'm about to say next. Growing up as a teenager is tough. The difficulties of my situation only complicated things further. For one, I didn't have the constant extended family that I could depend on. They were all in South America, Europe, anywhere else other than inside of the United States. Not having these nets of support forced me to rely on my small family of 4, and like most adolescents, growing up in a blended family, meaning that one half of my family consisted of my mother and stepbrother, and the other half of just my father and I expressed rebellion in my search for self-identity and independence. Underlying this behavior was, of course, hurt, grief, and depression. But I knew my parents loved me. So why did I so often push their limits, break their rules, and make my own path? I realized it wasn't a question of whether my parents loved me or not. Teenagers like myself need to feel this love, and the reason I didn't was because my family lacked the information on how to communicate this love effectively on an emotional level. My parents not necessarily know my love language, which is quality time. So while my father may have given me affirmative words or gifts, I never truly felt this love because he was rarely present due to his job. He would come home late and would work through entire weekends, and for many reasons he couldn't always be there for me, and that was hard. My dad did not know how to communicate with me using my own love language, which made me feel almost as lost as I was when I was being spoken to in Spanish, when all I knew was French. But rather than placing all of the responsibility on him or on the rest of my family for a lack of understanding my own love language, I instead learned to understand his way of communicating to me and translated that into what I can perceive of as love. Because I know that the only thing that I can control is my own behavior and perception. In the same way, instead of holding on to our preconceived concepts, we can instead broaden our perspective by understanding our love language and those of others. We already saw how linguistic processes, such as the verbal distinctions between lighter and darker shades of blue in Russian, can meddle with even the simple non-linguistic task of color perception. In the same way, interpreting another person's love language may help to unmeddle our own perceptions. Love languages, understanding them, and understanding other people's love languages are just as important as verbal linguistics. If we want to effectively communicate with each other, we must bridge the communication gap that exists. Otherwise, we are futilely speaking different languages to people who will never understand us. Whether we're discussing microbes or whales or wolves or human beings, the fact of the matter is that the one thing that remains common between all of these species is communication. For us, this link is the interconnectedness of love. Although we may come from different backgrounds or speak different tongues, by understanding love languages, we take a few steps farther into closing the critical gaps that exist among, between, and within all forms of communication. Thank you.